But it just continues to get so much worse. The book says, who could forget the time he caught 2 of their children using cocaine? And during his subsequent anti-drug talk, you got to be careful. Your mom's an addict, okay? You've got bad genes thanks to your mom, so you better watch out for that cocaine. Proceeded then to lean down and take a few lines with them. You find your kids taking drugs. Midway through your anti-drug talk, you're like, well, what the hell? And you begin taking drugs with your kids after just throwing their mom under the bus. Dysfunction. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is True Denise, and today we're going to keep going in the Ask Not book by Maureen Callahan. And this time we're talking about Joan Kennedy. We're finishing her story. And after this, we've got 6 more women to talk about, and they will be individual episodes. They won't be parts of a whole. So we're almost done with this, which means we need to think about what we're going to read next. Now, at the beginning of the summer, I polled you guys on Instagram to find out if you wanted to read this one or if you wanted to read Tom Bower's book about the Beckhams. And this one narrowly came ahead. So that's why we started with this one. And I think we're enjoying the Kennedy talk, and we may want to keep going down a Kennedy rabbit hole, or we may want to do the original plan, and when we're done with this, move on to the Beckhams. So it's really up to you guys what you want to do. I'm going to put a poll out on Instagram later today, so if you aren't following me on Instagram, please do, and then that will help me decide what you guys want. All right, let's go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover in this chapter, and I really do want this to just be a part 3. I don't think we have enough material to drag it into a 4th episode, so I really want to get started today without me ant-manning too much. Okay, how swinging should a First Lady be? In the run-up to Ted's inevitable announcement, this was what the media focused on: Joan's looks. In the style sections and women's magazines, other women disparaged Joan's appearance and affect, taking her apart surgically in ways Ted had never had to endure. They criticized her miniskirts, her knee-high boots, how she wore her hair and makeup. They pilloried her for wearing skirts without slips and gowns with side slits. Even the doctor treating Joan for alcoholism called her assistant Marcia and asked if she might persuade Joan to tone down her makeup and wardrobe to look like less of a showstopper and more, well, ladylike. Ted had put him up to that. Joan knew it. No one was telling Ted to go on a diet or do something about his ruddy alcoholic complexion or quit drinking altogether, which he really needed to do. No, Joan and her hemlines were the problem. No one understood that Joan was trying to get the attention of the only man who mattered, her husband, while also sticking it to him. Her clothes were acts of rebellion. She was a gorgeous woman in her mid-30s, coming into her own alongside American feminism. She was asserting her independence as the wife of the country's leading Democrat, a man who fought for the country's downtrodden, for civil rights and universal health care. But when it came to women, forget it. Ted refused to support the Equal Rights Amendment. At least it was in keeping with his terrible treatment of women in private. Few aside from Kennedy wives knew the indignities, as Joan did, of slinking away from a party thrown in your own home, having watched your husband flirt with every other woman in the room, only to hear the whispers later that he'd had sex in the library with one of your guests after you went to bed. Or to have lunch with a friend at the Ritz, seen by all of Boston's high society, only to learn that that friend too had slept with Ted, and that Joan was the last to know. Or to have your husband picking up women and bringing them, along with his supplicant aide, back to the house to do lines of cocaine and have sex while the children were upstairs, presumably asleep. Those encounters usually took place in the jacuzzi that Ted had installed in the backyard for threesomes. Is this true? Are these the people who are sitting in the Senate? Are these our politicians? Oh, Lord Jesus, come back. There was nothing he couldn't lie about, no corner he couldn't cut. He was a supremely unserious man, who the media kept propping up as Camelot's next hope, even as they knew better. Everyone on the Hill knew about the drug box Ted kept in his desk in the Senate. They'd all heard the stories about the 14-year-old girl he tried to rape and whose parents he'd paid off, or the high school girl he had hired as an intern and begun having sex with. She was only 17. The waitresses he'd sexually assaulted, the cruises around D.C. in the back of his limo rolling down his window, trying to pick up young women. I mean, I can hardly read this. Why was he like this? Was he in rebellion against the job he had to do? Did he want somebody to pull him out of his Senate seat, throw him in the street and be like, you're done? I mean, it's like these are the actions of someone who does not want the job they have. Somebody who is actively trying to lose the job that they have. But it just continues to get so much worse. The book says, who could forget the time he caught 2 of their children using cocaine? And during his subsequent anti-drug talk, you got to be careful. Your mom's an addict, okay? You've got bad genes thanks to your mom, so you better watch out for that cocaine. Proceeded then to lean down and take a few lines with them. What? You find your kids taking drugs midway through your anti-drug talk, you're like, well, what the hell? And you begin taking drugs with your kids after just throwing their mom under the bus. Dysfunction. Okay, well, also, let's not forget the 2 abortions at least one of his mistresses had had. And then, there was a dinner party that Ted threw. Joan was asleep upstairs, and he calls the nanny, and he tells the nanny, just put on Joan's clothes, you play hostess. And it was as if Ted was saying that his wife was on par with the hired help. That she was there to cook and host parties and dress up and be sexually available. Nothing more. And if his actual wife couldn't fulfill these very basic duties, I mean, really, what did a Kennedy man have to do around here to get a little respect? Any woman would do. Joan Kennedy, he seemed to be saying, was interchangeable, inconsequential, unnecessary, really. The only other humiliation that came close was Ted walking a reporter out to their parked car where Joan had passed out. Do you see what I have to deal with? He said. What? I mean, the original gaslighter, right? I mean, I hate that term, but because it's just so overused, but here he is, raging alcoholic, snorting cocaine at work, everywhere he can get it with his kids. And then he has the audacity to drag a reporter over to his car with her, where his wife is passed out. And yes, she had her own problems, but used her as fodder to get the attention off himself. Let me start a fire over here. Let's watch that fire burn. Pay no attention to the dumpster fire raging in your face. That is me, Ted Kennedy. Ted was a drunk too, but no one criticized him the way they did Joan. His pain was valorized, his drinking, drugging, and womanizing excused. He had 3 dead brothers, he had an alcoholic wife, and now Teddy Jr., poor sick child, hey, he's entitled. Why can't Teddy be drunk? Wouldn't you be drunk under the same circumstances? I bet you wouldn't even be able to get out of bed, but look at him. He is actually sitting in the Senate. That's how much he cares about America. People, we need help. We need to want more from our politicians. We need to demand more. If we know these shenanigans are going on, throw them out of office. Why do we not want more? I mean, just as a side note, you guys, our politics are a mess. But who do we have to blame for that? Why are we electing people into office that we know are fools, idiots, narcissists, deranged maniacs, all of them? But who do we have to blame? There are good candidates out there. They just never seem to make it to the final rounds. And we're putting up with this kind of garbage. These aren't secrets. Maureen Callahan did not just tell you something you didn't know about Ted Kennedy. She might have, compiled all these facts together, and when you hear them in a litany, like bang, 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 you're like, good Lord, what is wrong with that person? But nobody was under any delusions that Ted Kennedy was a person that you would want sitting in the Senate. We've known this. We've known, even if we knew 1/4 of what we just read, which I can say we did, that person should never have gotten anyone's vote. We need to do better, people. Come on, we've got to do better. These kinds of shenanigans, people in power, we're the ones who put the people in power. What's going on here, friends? Okay, back to the story. He's allowed to be drunk because he's had a hard life. So it was Ted on the cover of People magazine with Teddy Jr. teaching the 12-year-old to ski 4 months after losing part of his leg to cancer. It was Ted and his team who told the media that he had been the one to break the news to their son that he was going to need an amputation. Ted's team told people that Joan wasn't on this momentous ski trip because she wasn't feeling well. You know what we mean, though. Drunk. Too bad Jonesy couldn't be there for Teddy. Teddy Jr. would have loved to have his mom on that ski trip. what with just one leg and learning how to ski all over again, but Jonesy wasn't feeling too good. Joan had kept it together through the worst of Teddy Jr.'s illness and treatment, and only then, when he was home and safe and recovering, did she let herself fall apart. The month after that story ran, Joan found herself on the cover of the same magazine. "Joan Kennedy," the headline read. It wasn't a nervous breakdown. She only needed a rest. The story inside, by well-known journalist Liz Smith, explained why Joan had just spent 3 weeks at Silver Hill in Connecticut, which Smith described as a private sanatorium. Joan's alcoholism was minimized. Indeed, Silver Hill was and remains known as a rehabilitation facility for the rich and famous. Smith instead cited the pressures of being a Kennedy wife. "She has accepted the realities of her married life," Smith wrote. "The senator's frequent neglect. Ted only pays attention to Joan when he needs her," says one jaundiced Washington source. "His eye for a pretty girl, his early to late political habits." She also noted Ted's desire that Joan not seek outside help. Senator Kennedy, Smith reported, didn't want his wife to see a psychiatrist in the first place, and had to be convinced some years back that it was vital. Among Joan's many torments was her fear that Ted, despite all he put her through, would meet the same fate as Jack and Bobby. A part of her was still deeply in love with Ted, who could turn his attention to her at any given moment and make her feel like the only woman he had ever loved. "Nobody wants him to run," her father Harry said. "Nobody in the family on either side. They're all scared to death. Over and over, Joan keeps saying she hopes he does not run. Can you blame her? But what they know, and Joan knows this too, and this is what terrifies her, is that he's got to do what he feels he must. But they all pray he doesn't." Why must he, though? If everybody in the whole family was like, Ted cannot run for president, that is going to be some hot garbage juice, then why are they pushing him to do it? Why have they all put the drumbeat in his head the whole time? Politics, 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 senator, and then the White House. Over and over and over his whole life. That's all he's ever heard. And I think the thing that's so infuriating is that you knew he wasn't good at it. Now he's finally on the threshold of possibly running for president, and everyone's, oh, Teddy. Don't do it, Teddy. What? Don't do it. You shouldn't do it. It's not for you. But you spent his whole life refusing him entrance into any other career. We're political people here, right? And now that he's finally, against all odds, slogged to the finish line of potentially being able to throw in his hat into the presidential ring, and everyone's like, oh, Teddy. Ooh, that's going to be hard to handle. Yeah, you're right, it is. Everyone knew it all along. So why is everyone like, I hope he doesn't feel like he has to. Well, yeah, he does. Where did he get that idea from? Anybody got any takers? Anybody know where that idea came from? In the end, Ted did feel that he must try to run for president. And months before Ted announced in 1980, mounting an intra-party challenge against President Jimmy Carter, whose personal character was unassailable, meetings were called, strategies debated. The main worry wasn't Chappaquiddick or Ted's alcoholism or his rampant womanizing. The real problem they all agreed on was that Joan was an issue. How are we going to handle Joan? That raging terror. The girl can't even pick herself up off of a Boston street, drunk as a skunk, over there laying in the gutter bold as an owl. What are we going to do about that? If only Ted had somebody he could rely on. If only Ted had someone he could rely on, somebody who wasn't always such a liability. Who knows what heights Ted's career could have met if it hadn't been for old Joan. So everyone's wondering, what are they going to do with Joan? Sometimes she was apprised of Ted's prep meetings and sometimes not. Sometimes she was invited to participate, sometimes not. She could tell herself that it was the nature of the beast, or that their unconventional marriage explained his campaign's unorthodox approach. That was fine. They could handle Ted as they saw fit. But they weren't going to handle Joan. Joan was reinventing herself on her own terms, and had been doing so for some time. In 1972, she sat down with Good Housekeeping for a cover story and spoken candidly of things few women did. Joan was in analysis, seeing a psychiatrist 3 times a week. She was working hard on her sobriety. She was still struggling with her self-worth. It's very easy to feel insecure when you marry into a very famous, intelligent, exciting family, Joan said. It's been very difficult. You start comparing yourself to the other Kennedy women, and somehow your confidence in yourself begins to evaporate. Jackie remained the lone sister-in-law Joan really, truly enjoyed. As Liz Smith wrote in a separate column, Joan admires Jackie's bright culture, taste, and most of all, witty bitchery. Jackie herself loved poking fun at Joan's naivete. "Joan," she'd say, "you're hopeless. We'll never corrupt you." Joan didn't want to be corrupted. She did, however, long to be considered as stylish as Jackie. That same year, sick of criticism from top fashion magazines and supermarket tabloids, Joan traded in her more overtly sexy evening wear for more sophisticated, well-tailored clothes meant to reflect a new Joan, a more mature Joan, a woman embracing her natural beauty. Still, she refused to apologize for the way she had previously dressed. If other people were scandalized, that was on them. To Good Housekeeping, she dismissed reports of Ted's womanizing and said she believed everything he had told her about Chappaquiddick. Probably because he hadn't told her anything, so there wasn't much there that she had to not believe. The last thing she wanted was pity or sympathy. When that cover story hit newsstands, Joan thought Ted would be proud. But she had violated the #1 rule of being a Kennedy. Do not air your problems in public. Drinking, adultery, rehabs, Kennedy family squabbles, that was all bad enough. But psychiatry? It was enough of a concession on his part that she even got treatment. Why did she have to be so public about it? Did she want people to think that she was crazy? Was she trying to torpedo Ted's chances? Okay, just real quick. Side note. I raise an eyebrow at the fact that the author is saying, unless Joan has come out before and said, and I need to look back at her notes in the back and see from whence this springs. Because I don't think that the Kennedy family is against psychiatry. The God himself, John F. Kennedy, put his own wife in a mental institution and she got electroshock therapy. Now, I don't know if putting her in the rehab center was as a attempt to shame her into good behavior. Was JFK putting her there because he really thought she needed to be there? Was it something they had discussed? Was it something like she's like, I need to get help. I can't get out of my head. I'm very depressed. I don't know exactly how involved Jackie was in going to that place. But clearly the family has interacted before with some psychiatrists. I don't know. Whatever. Maybe Ted personally had some problems with it. Anyway, his coldness and criticism sent Joan back to the bottle, which only made Ted more contemptuous. "Here she goes again," he'd say right in front of the children. Oh my God, I can't believe it. We don't need to involve the children in the grown-up disputes. But one other thing I was going to say is how hypocritical of him to be mad at her for bringing up the fact that they have personal problems. Is this not the guy who literally dragged a reporter over to his car to show him a passed out wife? Is that not involving the media in your personal problems? So when Joan does it and just has a sit down, normal conversation, she's not, giving evidence. She's not dragging people over to embarrassing scenes and being like, get a picture of that for your article. She was just talking about her life. Oh God, no, we don't do that. But Ted can grab a reporter by the elbow and steer him over to the car and be like, look what I have to deal with. That seems far worse. But he wouldn't divorce her, Yeah, she's this big noose around his neck, Here he is drowning. But he can't get rid of her because, he's Catholic and they don't divorce. It was a kind of excruciating punishment being needed by her Catholic husband as a political prop, but feeling only his disgust. Being so public about her struggles was revenge, to be sure. But using her platform for good was gratifying. She was helping people, namely other unhappy people who, like her, had been inspired by Gloria Steinman and Betty Friedan. The culture was waking up. In October 1974, Joan found herself, along with Betty Ford and Pat Nixon, on the cover of Time magazine. "The Ordeal of Political Wives" was the headline, and inside were multiple pieces on the demands specific to these women, who were expected to be domestic goddesses, paragons of femininity, perfect mothers, tireless campaign surrogates, and stoics nonpareil. Joan was covered with extreme sensitivity. In the writing of her struggles, Time noted, "Ted has not been much help with his frequent absences and his magnetic attraction for women. She's almost never alone with him," notes a family friend, although she is always hopeful. "There are always 10 advisors around the house, 84 people on the boat, and sisters-in-laws and kids everywhere. Ted does not deliberately ignore her, but he scarcely treats her as his equal. Though he did take her to Russia last spring and let her meet party leader Brezhnev, he wanted her to listen without asking questions." Such intense pressure, as Time concluded, understandably resulted in Joan's substance abuse and subsequent need for help. Of course she needed treatment at Silver Hill. Of course she was seeing a psychiatrist. Of course she deserved to recover her health and develop a greater sense of her own self. There in the August pages of the nation's foremost weekly news publication, Joan Kennedy had been vindicated. She wasn't mentally ill. She wasn't crazy, as Ted would have her to believe. Her yearning for accomplishments on her own terms was a human desire, not specific to gender, and she was learning that she was not alone in feeling dissatisfied as a wife and mother. That being depressed did not make her ungrateful or weak. She was not only allowed to find her bliss, she owed that to herself. Find her bliss. Kind of a lame statement, but I get what she's saying. But it wasn't to be for Joan, because everywhere she turns, people are trying to take advantage of her. The book says that the bicentennial in 1976 was a consequential year for Joan. She found herself still grappling with alcohol and checked into a New York City facility. One of her fellow patients in group therapy sold Joan's confessions to the National Enquirer. Among them, criticisms of Ethel. She said, "You don't dare discuss sex in front of her, and there's no such sex education for the kids." Rose Kennedy, who she called a harridan, who has a fit when she thinks I don't behave properly, and about the family itself. "I'm not as bright as they are," Joan said, "and I'm so tired of being the dumb blonde of the Kennedy family. I've never been able to compete, so I've always been on the perimeter instead of inside the family circle." While under inpatient care, Joan often used her maiden name. "I'm not a Kennedy by birth," she said. "I want to be recognized as an individual. I'm the wife of a Kennedy, but I'm not one of the Kennedy girls. I live and I think differently." Even Jackie, whom Joan claimed to have the most in common with, wasn't spared. Joan's complicated feelings toward the sister-in-law she admired and envied, and who kept Joan at a certain remove, despite Joan's wish for a close relationship, was unleashed in one of those sessions. "Jackie's always been the queen," Joan said. "She can't stand competition from anybody. And considering how the other Kennedy girls look, I guess Jackie felt I was the only Kennedy who could be competition for her. Jackie and I were never very close." She spoke of hitting her limit and exploding during a Kennedy family gathering. "I ran through every one of the damn Kennedys like a machine gun. I just had had enough. I'd had it up to here. I blasted them all to the face. I let them know exactly how I felt about them." That was the only time that you could hear a pin drop in a room full of Kennedys. It was something I'd wanted to do for a long time, but I hadn't had the courage. I decided I wasn't going to be a mouse anymore. The mouse indeed had roared. Ever self-protective, the Kennedys backed Joan, calling that report, which gained national traction, unadulterated gossip. But the chasm caused by the expose was permanent, and perhaps Joan wanted it that way. By the fall of 1977, Joan had quietly left Ted and moved into her own place, a gorgeous condominium in Boston's Back Bay. Publicly, they were still married, but Joan was breaking away. She was immersing herself in movies and books that depicted the modern woman's struggle. Marilyn French's feminist novel, The Women's Room, and Anne Bancroft's performance in The Turning Point particularly resonated. She began attending AA meetings and found the candor and solidarity there more therapeutic than any of the fancy rehabs she'd been to, or any of the mental hospitals where Joan had been diagnosed with numerous nervous and psychiatric disorders. As Joan was learning, she was just depressed, and much of her depression wasn't congenital or chemical. It was situational. It was her marriage, and what she had been expected to tolerate. Yeah, no kidding. I mean, I don't know if it takes a degree to realize that's why she was depressed. Let me just say real quick, why in the world would any rehab center that she had been attending require her to be in group therapy when she has such famous relatives? That just seems like a recipe for disaster, because she's not talking about a bunch of anonymous people. The rehab directors cannot bank on the fact that there isn't going to be some nosy loser in the group who's going to try to profit off of somebody's famous family who's being talked about in this group setting. I can... Honestly, the idea of group therapy already to me is wild because it just feels like a lot of people marinating in their sadness. AA meetings I get, which I guess is kind of like group therapy, but I don't know. I just feel like people are like more owning their struggle in that. Whereas group therapy, I feel like often seems to be, and I've never actually, okay, I'm saying this out of a vast amount of ignorance. So if you've been in a group therapy session and it was really helpful to you, I'm so happy. But it seems to me, when I think about what group therapy is, it's everybody coming together to have kind of like this weepathon and to marinate in the issue. But I sometimes wonder like how much help is given. So everybody like telling their story and everybody like piling on with like what my story is worse or I was treated worse. And then you've got somebody whose family is the Kennedys and she's opening up like, you know, and ushering everybody into this sacred, you know, unknown space of Kennedy drama that nobody gets to hear about. You can't expect that everybody in that group is going to handle that information with maturity. And it just seems like the rehab directors should have realized that that is not the place to put somebody who has relatives that are very well known. If you want to come to group therapy and talk about how, Aunt Marge was mean to you as a kid and like didn't give you as big a piece of cake as she gave to your cousin or whatever your problem was. Okay, nobody knows Aunt Marge, but you want to come into there and talk about Jackie Kennedy and Ethel Kennedy and all of this. That's going to raise some ears. Okay, and that kind of talk, even if it had never reached the pages of the National Enquirer, that's going to be, surely all those people would then, once they get out of rehab, they go to their family and be like, you'll never believe I was in rehab with Joan Kennedy. Do you know what she said? And that kind of gossip would run rampant because, everyone has an opinion of who they think Jackie and Ethel already are. And this is interesting. Nobody want to care if you come back and be like, well, there's this one girl who talked all the time about her Aunt Marge. Who cares? Anyway, that was dumb. That was dumb planning on the part of the people who put her in rehab and had her do group therapy. Okay, that was a rant, but still. Okay. Let's see, where are we? Okay. As for her vaunted rival, Jackie was in psychoanalysis too, and she had gotten a job as a book editor in New York, working at Viking for $200 a week. If the most famous woman in the world could earn her own money, derive self-esteem from using her brain, and carve out a post-Kennedy identity for herself while confronting her demons, well, why couldn't Joan? She went back to school to get her master's in education, even though she doubted she would really ever teach. I want the credibility that little piece of paper will give me, she said. Once I have that, I won't just be Joan Kennedy. That's important for a lot of women my age. She was only 41. No woman in political life, besides Betty Ford, had ever been so public about her struggles with addiction and mental health. I couldn't believe how hard it was to stop, Joan told People magazine for a cover story that Ted had set up to ease his path into the 1980 nomination. Alcoholism is a baffler. I was a periodic drinker, not a daily one, but God knows, toward the end of my drinking, talk about being enslaved. Her sobriety had set her free in many ways. It had given her a sense of who she was, what she wanted, and how to stand up for herself. It was hard for Ted at first, she said, because I used to say yes, dear, to everything. And now I can say no. Well, I love the fact that she's able to be so open about it, and to talk about the fact that she was enslaved to her alcoholism and that, it is a disease that just progresses and progresses and progresses and gets worse and worse and worse. And one that is just so easy in its slow progression to getting worse, to tell yourself, I still have this under control. It's not a big thing. I got it. I've known alcoholics, and I think that as long as they are not in a gutter, they will never realize that things have gotten bad. The 10th anniversary of Mary Jo's death was approaching. As with every re-election cycle, Ted's staff encouraged him to call Mary Jo's parents and feel them out. Oh, brother, Ted said. As ever, when he did make the call, he did not take responsibility or offer Gwen and Joe Kopechne any of the details he kept promising to share. He just apologized that the anniversary, was going to generate renewed headlines, and for that, Ted was sorry. He took their temperature about his presidential run for obliquely referencing the media speculation surrounding it. The Kopechnes, who had heard so much of this before, let him speak and got off the phone. Ted took that to mean that they would keep quiet. Thank God that's over, Ted said. Going forward, he and his staff would call Chappaquiddick a manageable problem. Joan, however. Joan was not. But he needed her. He needed her as Jack had needed Jackie. Domesticity, above all, was what Ted needed to sell. But he wasn't moving with the times. He didn't realize that American women were questioning sexual mores in politics, rejecting the idea that men somehow knew better, wondering why they could get fired for being pregnant, or, if they weren't fired, why there were no paid maternity leaves, why the wage gap was something that they were just supposed to accept, why, if their husbands made them have sex when they said no, that wasn't considered rape. The American woman was changing. Ted didn't spend enough time with Joan to realize that she was changing too. So when Joan sat for yet another profile, this one for the Women's Monthly McCall's, Joan on the cover in a white dress, Ted was at her side, holding her arm as if to keep her in line. This new Joan, the one Ted had spent no time getting acquainted with, went rogue. She validated the whispers about Ted's womanizing. The rumors and stories, Joan said, hurt my feelings. Of course they hurt my feelings. They went to the core of my self-esteem. When one grows up feeling that one is sort of special and hoping that one's husband thinks so, and then suddenly thinking maybe he doesn't. Well, I didn't lose my self-esteem altogether, but it was difficult to hear all the rumors. And I began thinking, well, maybe I'm just not attractive enough or attractive anymore. And so, rather than get mad or ask questions concerning the rumors about Ted and his girlfriends, or really stand up for myself at all, it was easier for me to just go and have a few drinks and calm myself down, as if I weren't hurt or angry. Joan had gone off script. Her husband's advisors, including his sister Eunice, had given Joan in-depth media training, telling her how to answer every question that was sure to come her way. She was supposed to dismiss all those stories about Ted and other women as gossip and lies. Give boilerplate answers. Pretend theirs was a happy marriage. Pretend that she, Joan Kennedy, was happy. But why? Why should she do that? Like, I don't understand, like, what the motivation would be for her to continue to prop him up. He's mean to her. He's rude to her. He ignores her. What reason should she say all these things for? If they had, like, this super happy marriage and, like, there was this one time when he had stepped out, but they had dealt with it. They had gone to therapy for it. You know, they were both, like, radically honest with each other, very transparent, loved each other so much. They got past it. If people wanted to bring that up and she were, you know, and she wasn't sure how to answer and the family had coached her to say, hey, you know, we're not talking about that, or that's not true, or you know, whatever it may be. Yeah, go to bat for your husband, you know, stand up for him. But marriages have such ups and downs in marriages. You know, it's like, I'm not saying you need to, you know, you're not an honest person if you're not willing to just get into all the nitty gritty about your spouse's problems. But what I don't understand is, what was she getting out of being in this marriage? Like, why did Ted think that it was her responsibility to constantly cover for him? Why did the family think it was her responsibility to constantly cover for him? What was she getting out of this deal? The Kennedy name? Like, that doesn't really feel like there was a lot of benefits to that. If this whole thing is going to be transactional, and it clearly was from the get-go, what is she getting out of the transaction? So for anybody to be legitimately shocked that she went rogue and had a say during this interview, how? Joan has been beaten down by this family since day one. Somebody just like handing her stacks of cash, diamonds, and gold bars. What exactly is her payment for living a life that is indescribably painful? Constantly. When one reporter asked her point blank if her husband still loved her, she answered honestly, I don't know. She said, I really don't know. But Joan still loved him. His need for her on the campaign trail was real, and she was flourishing. Once an introvert, she could barely get through a weekend with the extended Kennedy clan without stealing away for hours to read a book or take a nap. Joan was now feeding off of the reception that other women gave her, who saw in Joan a woman done wrong, a woman stronger than Ted or any of the Kennedys gave her credit for. When Ted had decided to run for president, Joan not only supported him, but agreed to campaign wholeheartedly, despite her fears for his safety. She was beginning to understand what an asset she was. It helped her that there were more women in the press pool now. It helped that there was a winnowing of Kennedy worship. Ted's run made people look more closely at him, more critically, and the public didn't like what it was seeing. Throughout a key hour-long primetime interview that Ted did for CBS News, Joan was notably absent. Ted was unable to give a coherent answer about what had happened at Chappaquiddick, or why he wanted to be president. Ted's drinking never came up, but he made sure to bring up Joan's struggles with alcohol. I don't know whether there's a single word that should have a description for it, he said. Joan's involved in a continuing program to deal with the problems of alcoholism, and she's going magnificently well. And I'm immensely proud of the fact that she's faced up to it and made the progress that she's made. And but that progress continues, and it's a type of disease that one has to work. Oh, is it, Ted? Would you know about the work? Would you know about the work that it takes to become sober when you are inebriated constantly and continually 24 hours a day? Do you understand the work that it would take to quit that cocaine addiction? Do you understand, Ted? I don't think so, because you haven't tried it. Ted's usual deflections were no longer acceptable. As far back as 1972, National Lampoon ran a parody of a Volkswagen ad written by the future star humorist Ann Beatts, with the car floating upside down in a pond. If Ted Kennedy drove a Volkswagen, the copy read, he'd be president today. In 1972, Saturday Night Live aired a brutal sketch of Bill Murray as Ted, soaked with seaweed hanging off his shoulder, arriving late and breathless to a campaign stop. I think that Joan might still be in the car. It's not funny, but it is. I gotta find that Saturday Night Live episode. Okay, all right. I think Joan might be in the Oh, Saturday Night Live used to be good. All right, women especially were no longer buying Ted's excuses. Yeah, I bet. Well, he's destroying one, driving one into the ground. He drowned another. I think it's time for us to give up on Ted's excuses. They were no longer willing to look the other way as voters to minimize what was openly known as Ted's relentless womanizing. They were no longer going to allow all his problems to be blamed on Joan. Susanna Lessard wrote a groundbreaking 6-page piece that ran in the Washington Monthly, which picked it up after the New Republic, original commissioners of the piece, had killed it. Charlie Peters, the Monthly's editor-in-chief, said that he thought Lessard's piece had important and wise things to say about women and their relationship to Ted Kennedy. Headlined, Kennedy's Woman Problem, Women's Kennedy Problem. Lessard's piece argued that female voters had been hoodwinked by the boys in the press who kept Ted's philandering secret. Despite the male-led apologia that such talk was sleazy or betrayed a lesser mind, that of course women, their small world defined by domestic concerns, would be more preoccupied with the male politician's sex life than his policies, Lessard argued that Ted's chronic cheating was legitimate cause for concern. Yes, it is. Because if you can't be true and fair and honest and above board with the people that you said I do to, your wife and your children, then why in the world should a country expect that you would ever be fair and above board with them? It suggests an old-fashioned male chauvinistic exploitative view of women as primarily objects of pleasure, Lessard wrote. It gives me the creeps. The constant pursuit, although the image is almost passive in a way, of semi-covert, just barely personal and ultimately discardable encounters is a creepy way to act. What it suggests, she continued, is a severe case of arrested development, a kind of narcissistic intemperance, a huge babyish ego that must constantly be fed. It suggests, if he is immature in this area, mightn't he be in others? It bothers me because I associate this type of behavior with misogyny. I don't believe men who really like women carry on in this way. Jackie wrote Joan a letter making the same argument. Save yourself. Get a divorce. You're no prude or fool, Jackie wrote, but having your own little black phone, as Ted did, so that you can talk to Mootsie or Pootsie every night right in the house with his wife and children, and bringing them there when you're away, what kind of a woman, but a sap or a slave, can stand that and still be a loving wife, and care about him and work like a dog for his campaigning? Jackie could have been talking to a younger version of herself. This was the Jackie who would tell her grown children that if Jack had somehow returned to her now, she very well might turn him away. Which is really saying something. Jackie had taken quite a trajectory turn of her own. If she could say that if Jack somehow were able to come back to her, she would turn him down and say, no, I don't want to be married to you. But Joan couldn't leave Ted while he was running for president. Why not, Joan? Why, you think there's something for you at the end of this terrible, terrible dark tunnel that you've been crawling through? You're going to finally come out to the open and find a pot of gold? How has the media cared about you? Have they loved you? When you become first lady, if Ted wins, what do you think the scrutiny will be then? If you think your life has been a misery now, it's only going to get that much worse if you were to sit in the White House also with this buffoon who somehow never, ever, ever is criticized. And all the criticism that should be focused on Ted is somehow derailed and gone to Joan. Why did she want him to become president? Why wouldn't she leave him? He doesn't need to become president. She knows it. Does she care about the country at all? Anyway, Joan's not going to leave Ted while he's running for president, primarily because the Kennedys would not allow it. Besides, what Jackie didn't understand was the salutary effect campaigning was having on Joan. People were coming out to see her. They wanted to talk to her, and more incredibly, they wanted to hear what she had to say. And what do you know? The more favorable her press coverage became, the worse Ted's got. Soon his aides were begging Joan to make extra stops and be seen with Ted as much as possible. And when she did, Ted could barely look at her. He never touched her. And once again, he never said thank you. Joan's sobriety had given her a gift, the ability to embrace her rage. Is that a gift? I don't know. I mean, I guess I see what they're saying. You know, she's finally able to face reality as it should be, because without the softening effects of alcohol, she could finally deal with what needed to be done. But what then does one do with rage? Especially when it's aimed at, these fools. Fools like Ted Kennedy. They can't absorb your rage. They don't care. Well, instead of dulling it with alcohol, she was now feeling her rage, and it felt good, justified and appropriate. She was too well-mannered to ever show it in public, but in private she let loose, one day retreating from her window as Ted drove up to her condo. "Oh, here he comes," Joan said. "I'm getting out of here." And she left. America was getting a second look at Joan Kennedy, and they were rooting for her. The unspoken consensus was that the marriage to Ted Kennedy was a burden no woman should have to endure. I just want to say real quick, what I think is really sad about a lot of these stories, I thought this with Jackie too. This author, Maureen Callahan, continues to describe them at the end of their lives as being angry and, self-driven to find success. Like they feel entitled to, go and discover about themselves and figure out what they've been missing this whole time. And I get that, especially since you live under the boot of the Kennedy family and under the boot of a Kennedy man, you would want to rebel. I get that. But the picture of the woman, this like free woman who can do whatever she wants, always seems like somebody who has become super angry and super self-centered. Like, I spent my whole life thinking about other people. Now I'm going to think about myself, which, again, I understand how this trajectory happens. I understand the arc of that kind of story. I understand feeling like I've always given for everybody else. Now I'm going to concentrate on me. But I just feel like that's a really sad way to live life. If your last years are spent with you just kind of like constantly raging and being angry and being like, I'm going to make sure that everyone hears me roar. In essence, you're still under the boot of that last person. Because they're still making you, like, before you couldn't speak, now you can speak, but everything you're doing is as a reaction to them. And part of me just feels like, wouldn't it be a better life if you could live free of them, free of rage, free of the need to prove to them that you were your own person? Like, just go be your own person. Don't let that other person have a stranglehold on you and you call that being free. A lot of these women seem like they just ended up alone and angry and sad, but tried to call it victory and freedom. Anyway, the chapter ends by saying, Joan's journey, back on board with steady eyes and new strength, said Mira McPherson in the Washington Post. Time magazine explored the vulnerable side of Jonesy, writing of her alcoholism as a disease, not a moral failing, and the toll Ted's womanizing had taken. The Boston Globe wrote, Joan strides out of her dark age. The New York Times ran a glowing piece on Joan's advocacy. She was fighting for passage of Equal Rights Amendment, saying things that at the time were still controversial, that all women should have access to higher education, to employment, to the same pay as men, that motherhood was devalued in American society and too often left women financially dependent on their husbands. On the surface, Joan appeared to be campaigning for her husband. But whom was she fighting for, really? I know that if Ted is elected president of the United States, Joan said, I will commit myself to the ongoing struggle for women's equality with everything I have and everything I am. It was an outgrowth of all the inner work that she had done on herself, admitting that the Joan Kennedy of the 1960s didn't get it. Feminism, the ERA, the fight for reproductive rights and equality within marriage itself. I really thought it was for other women, Joan said, and now I know it's for me too. She could have stayed. Even after he dropped out of the race for president on August 11, 1980, Ted, for the sake of his career, would have done anything to keep the marriage intact. But Joan, it turned out, had been campaigning for herself all along. And that's the end of Joan's story. I have to say, I find it a little depressing. Yeah, I'm glad she got sober. That's fantastic. I mean, I'm not saying that sarcastically at all. That's wonderful. I'm really glad that she was able to find sobriety and to find some peace and to find that life really was worth living. And that she could get out from underneath this Kennedy hold. And I think that as she was trying to figure out and to find the strength to get out from the hold that they had on her, in the attempt to get out, she had to get angry. And we saw this with Jackie Kennedy as well. I said this when we talked about Jackie. Your life is going to feel markedly better when you're no longer being abused by someone, right? So get the abuser out of the way. How could things not feel better? But is that still a life you would choose? If you could choose any life ever, if you could just look through a catalog and pick a life, would being alone in your own condo, incensed by your past and infuriated at the future that your ex has, is that the life that you want? I feel like we are just made for more than vengeance, bitterness. I feel like we're made for more than a reactionary life to our abusers. And I'm sad that this author continues to act as though these women found a better place in unmooring themselves from tradition. Not that tradition is the only way to go. I'm not saying that at all. But it seems like this author is suggesting that by sloughing off the traditional role of wife and mother, that's when they actually became free women. I think this is just a really jacked up and messy lie that we've been told. You can choose to be a wife mom if you want to. That's one way to go. But you actually aren't going to find out who you are as long as you've got those kids around your neck or your husband always needing something from you, and that you just need to find a way to express yourself away from all these needy paws, constantly overstimulating with their needs and their touching and their constant demands on you. And that once you finally realize that these people are asking too much of you, and once you finally, get the courage to stand up to this mob that you call a family, once you finally get them straightened out, let them know that you're a human too and that you have things that you need. Once all that's figured out, then you'll truly be free. And I guess I just sort of think that what a sad way to view the people that you say that you love. And now, I know Joan's situation with the Kennedys is completely different because she really was in an abusive situation and that family really was crazy. But I feel like we're using this extreme scenario, and I feel like people have constantly, over time, used this extreme scenario of women in abusive relationships as a description of what it is to be a woman. And I feel like it isn't, what it is to be a woman is not to be abused. These people are abused. Are you abused? Like, do you need to take on the mantle of their abuse and say, as a woman, I'm going to fight against people who try to keep me down? That person was being kept down. But as a whole, are all of us women being kept down? I don't think so. My final thoughts on the whole Joan story. I'm so glad that she got out of that abusive situation. I'm so glad that she was able to find the strength to deal with her need for sobriety and, get away from the scenarios that were causing her to, fall into her deeper temptations. I wish that her story felt more redemptive at the end. I feel like it just kind of peters out, and I feel like she replaces a really horrible abusive situation by just being alone now. I'm sad to think that triumph could look so disappointing. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys in the comments, and I so appreciate you guys so much. Bye.